Hey guys, tonight we begin with women who chose not to marry in a world where marriage wasn't optional, it was survival. For centuries, refusing marriage meant facing poverty, social exile, and religious condemnation. Yet thousands of women found ways to live independently when society said independence was impossible. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What if I told you that medieval women who refused marriage faced being labelled as unnatural, sinful, or insane? That families could legally force daughters into convents or marriages against their will? That unmarried women had almost no legal rights to property, work, or even physical safety? What if you discovered that despite these obstacles, women developed elaborate survival strategies? Some became nuns, not from religious calling, but from pragmatic need for security. Some disguised themselves as widows to gain the legal status widows enjoyed. Some formed communities of unmarried women who lived and worked together outside both marriage and convent walls. What if you learned that the women who refused marriage weren't just rebels or misfits, but included some of medieval society's most educated, wealthy, and influential people, women who chose independence over security and created lives that challenged everything their world believed about women's nature and women's proper roles? Tonight, you are going to discover how unmarried women survived in medieval society, when almost every social, legal, and economic structure was designed to force women into marriage. You are going to learn about the legal and economic realities that made marriage seem inevitable, laws that denied unmarried women property rights, economic systems that made independent female survival nearly impossible, social pressures that labelled unmarried women as failures and threats. You are going to meet real women who refused marriage and the specific strategies they used to survive, entering convents, joining religious communities, claiming false widow status, working in trades that accepted women, forming communities with other unmarried women, and sometimes disguising their gender entirely. And you are going to understand why women refused marriage despite enormous costs, what their lives actually looked like, and how their resistance to compulsory marriage gradually helped create more options for women who came after them. According to research by Professor Judith Bennett from the University of Southern California, whose work examines medieval women's history, the number of women who never married in medieval Europe varied by time and place, but generally ranged from 10 to 20% of the female population, substantial minorities who lived outside marriage either by choice or by circumstance. But the category of unmarried women was itself complex, and included women with very different situations and motivations. Some women actively refused marriage, rejecting proposals and family pressure to remain single. Others wanted to marry but couldn't find acceptable matches due to insufficient dowries, physical disabilities, or simply lack of available men in communities where war, disease, or migration created gender imbalances. Professor Bennett's research reveals that medieval society viewed unmarried women with suspicion and hostility, regardless of why they were unmarried. The prevailing ideology held that all women should be under male authority, first fathers, then husbands, and if widowed, adult sons or male guardians. A woman who lived outside these structures of male authority was seen as unnatural, dangerous, and potentially sinful. Religious teachings emphasized that marriage was women's natural state, that women were created to be wives and mothers, that refusing these roles violated divine order. Unmarried women were stereotyped as bitter, jealous, sexually frustrated, and prone to witchcraft or other antisocial behaviors. According to Professor Bennett, the economic realities of medieval life made independent survival extremely difficult for unmarried women. Most occupations were organized through guilds that restricted or prohibited female membership. Women who worked independently faced legal restrictions, economic discrimination, and social stigma. Unmarried women couldn't own property in many jurisdictions, couldn't make legal contracts, couldn't inherit on equal terms with men, and had limited access to courts for enforcing their rights. An unmarried woman without family support faced serious risk of destitution, prostitution, or death from poverty and neglect. Think about the impossible situation unmarried women faced. Society said, marriage was your natural destiny and your only legitimate option, but marriage meant losing legal identity, becoming your husband's property, facing risks of death in childbirth, potentially marrying an abusive or incompetent man you had little choice in selecting. If you refused marriage, you faced economic hardship, social ostracism, legal vulnerability, and constant pressure to conform. There was no good option, only choices between different forms of constraint and different risks. Yet despite these realities, substantial numbers of women chose or accepted unmarried life, finding ways to survive and sometimes even thrive outside marriage's bounds. Let me tell you about the first major survival strategy for unmarried women entering religious life. According to research by Professor Penelope Johnson from New York University, whose work examines medieval monasticism, convents provided one of the few legitimate and socially acceptable options for women who didn't marry. Becoming a nun offered unmarried women legal status, economic security, community, and often opportunities for education and leadership that weren't available to married women. But religious life as survival strategy was complicated and had its own costs and constraints. Professor Johnson's research reveals that women entered convents for diverse reasons, and religious calling was only one among many motivations. Some women were placed in convents by families who couldn't or wouldn't provide marriage dowries, making the convent essentially a dumping ground for daughters' families didn't want to support. Other women entered convents to escape arranged marriages they found intolerable, choosing religious vows over marriages to men they didn't want to marry. Still others entered convents after being widowed, seeing religious life as preferable to remarriage or to vulnerable independence. And some women genuinely felt religious callings and wanted to devote their lives to spiritual pursuits rather than to marriage and family. According to Professor Johnson, the economic realities of convent life meant that even this supposed refuge for unmarried women was stratified by class and wealth. Most convents required substantial entrance dowries, payments families made to the convent in exchange for accepting daughters as nuns. These entrance dowries were often nearly as large as marriage dowries, meaning that families who couldn't afford marriage dowries also couldn't afford convent entrance. Poor women who wanted to enter religious life often could only become lay sisters, nuns without full status who did manual labor and domestic work, rather than participating in the intellectual and spiritual activities of choir nuns who came from wealthy families. Professor Johnson's research reveals that life in convents provided unmarried women with significant advantages compared to independent secular life. Nuns had legal status and protection that unmarried laywomen lacked. They lived in communities where they weren't isolated or vulnerable in ways single women living alone would be. They had guaranteed food, shelter, and clothing, basic security that was far from guaranteed for unmarried women trying to survive independently. And in many convents, nuns had access to education, to books, to intellectual and creative pursuits that were largely denied to laywomen regardless of marital status. But convent life also had serious limitations and costs. Women who became nuns gave up any possibility of marriage, family, sexual relationships, or independent lives outside religious structures. They were subject to strict rules, to surveillance by religious authorities, to hierarchies within convents that often replicated secular class divisions. They couldn't leave if they changed their minds. Religious vows were supposed to be permanent, and women who tried to leave convents faced legal and social consequences, and convents themselves were under male authority. Bishops and male religious orders controlled convents, made ultimate decisions about convent governance, and intervened in convent affairs regularly. Think about what it means that becoming a nun was one of the best options available to unmarried women. Religious life offered security and community, but it required women to give up autonomy, to submit to strict rules and male authority, to abandon any dreams of marriage or family. The fact that convent life represented a relatively privileged option for unmarried women demonstrates how limited women's choices were. When permanent religious vows and lifetime confinement within convent walls represented one of your better alternatives, the full range of options available to you was clearly quite constrained. Now, let me tell you about a specific woman who chose convent life explicitly to avoid marriage, and what her experience reveals about religious life as survival strategy. According to research by Professor Caroline Bynum from Columbia University, whose work examines medieval religious women, the 12th century mystic Hildegard of Bingen entered religious life at age 8 when her family placed her in a convent. But she later wrote that she was grateful for this path because it saved her from marriage and allowed her to develop her intellectual and spiritual gifts in ways marriage never would have permitted. Professor Bynum's research reveals that Hildegard came from a noble family that could have arranged an advantageous marriage for her, but instead chose to dedicate her to religious life. Whether this was primarily the family's decision or reflected young Hildegard's own preferences is unclear from historical records. But Hildegard's later writings make clear that she valued her religious life, seeing the convent as a space where she could exercise authority, pursue knowledge, compose music and theological works, and build a reputation as spiritual teacher and prophet. She eventually became abbess of her own convent, corresponded with emperors and popes, and exercised influence that would have been completely impossible for a married laywoman. According to Professor Bynum, Hildegard's writings reveal both advantages and frustrations of convent life for women who might have chosen different paths. She wrote with pride about her intellectual and spiritual achievements, about the community of women she led, about the respect she commanded from powerful men who sought her counsel. But she also wrote with frustration about male church authorities who tried to control her convent, about limited resources available to female religious communities compared to male monasteries, about restrictions on women's religious activities that had no parallels for men. Her life demonstrates both what convent life made possible for capable women and what limitations persisted even within religious institutions. Professor Bynum's research reveals that Hildegard explicitly contrasted her life with what marriage would have entailed. She wrote that marriage would have meant subjection to a husband's authority, consumption of her energy and time by household management and childbearing, isolation from intellectual and spiritual pursuits, and lack of any public voice or influence by remaining unmarried and entering religious life. She avoided these constraints and created a life of remarkable achievement and influence. But she also recognized that her opportunities came from her noble birth and from resources her family provided. Poor women who entered convents rarely achieved the autonomy and influence Hildegard enjoyed. Think about Hildegard of Bingen's life and what it reveals about convent life as alternative to marriage. For a woman of intelligence, ambition, and spiritual inclination, the convent could offer opportunities for education, leadership, creative work, and influence that marriage would have foreclosed. Hildegard became famous, commanded respect, shaped theology and spirituality in her era, achievements that would have been impossible if she had married. But her achievements were possible partly because of her exceptional abilities and partly because of advantages of noble birth and family resources. Most women in convents lived quieter, more constrained lives, even while enjoying the basic security and community that religious life provided. Let me tell you about the second major survival strategy, the Beguines, communities of religious women who lived together and supported themselves through work while maintaining religious observance, but without taking permanent vows. According to research by Professor Walter Simons from Dartmouth College, whose work examines the Beguine movement, Beguines represented remarkable innovation in medieval women's options. They created a middle path between marriage and convent, between secular and religious life, that allowed unmarried women to live with dignity, security, and relative autonomy. Professor Simons's research reveals that the Beguine movement began in the Low Countries in the early 13th century and eventually spread throughout much of Western Europe. Beguines were laywomen who chose to live in religious communities, usually in towns and cities, supporting themselves through various forms of work: textile production, teaching, care for the sick, manuscript copying. They lived communally in beguinages, enclosed neighborhoods or buildings where Beguines had their own rooms or small houses, but shared common spaces, religious observances, and mutual support. According to Professor Simons, what made Beguines distinctive was their flexibility and their resistance to traditional religious structures. Unlike nuns, Beguines didn't take permanent vows, meaning they could leave and marry if they chose. Unlike nuns, Beguines supported themselves through their own work rather than living on endowments and dowries. And unlike nuns, Beguines weren't subject to strict enclosure. They could move around cities, conduct business, maintain relationships with families and communities outside their beguinages. Beguines created a form of religious life that gave unmarried women many advantages of convent life, without some of the most constraining aspects. Professor Simons's research reveals that Beguines attracted women from diverse backgrounds and with various motivations. Some Beguines were wealthy women who could have married well but chose Beguine life instead, bringing substantial resources that helped establish and maintain beguinages. Others were poor women who couldn't afford marriage dowries or convent entrance fees, and found in beguinages affordable alternatives that provided security and community. Still, others were widows who joined beguinages rather than remarrying or trying to survive independently, finding in Beguine communities support and purpose after their husbands' deaths. The Beguine movement was enormously successful in some regions. By the late 13th century, perhaps 10% of adult women in some low country cities were Beguines, living in beguinages that ranged from small houses with a handful of women to large enclosed neighborhoods with hundreds of residents. The movement demonstrated that significant numbers of women, given alternatives to marriage that provided security and community, would choose those alternatives. Beguines proved that unmarried women could live respectably, support themselves, maintain religious observance, and build meaningful communities outside both marriage and traditional convents. But the Beguine movement also faced opposition and persecution. Church authorities were suspicious of women's religious communities that operated outside traditional monastic rules and male supervision. Critics accused Beguines of heresy, of false piety, of sexual misconduct, of inappropriate independence from male authority. In the 14th century, some church councils condemned Beguine movement as heretical, though enforcement of these condemnations varied by region. Some beguinages were suppressed. Some were forced to adopt formal monastic rules and become essentially convents, while others continued operating as semi-independent communities well into the early modern period. Think about what the Beguine movement reveals about unmarried women's desires and capabilities. Given opportunity to live in communities that provided security without requiring permanent vows or complete enclosure, substantial numbers of women chose this option. Beguines demonstrated that unmarried women could support themselves through work, could maintain religious observance and moral respectability, could create thriving communities without male supervision. The success of the movement showed that women didn't need marriage or traditional convents to live meaningful, secure, productive lives. But the opposition Begums faced also demonstrates how threatening independent women's communities were to authorities who believed women should be under male control. Now let me tell you about the third survival strategy, claiming widow status, even falsely. According to research by Professor Barbara Hannawalt from Ohio State University, whose work examines medieval women's lives, widows had significantly more legal rights and social acceptance than never-married women, and some unmarried women deliberately claimed to be widows to gain access to widows' privileges and protections. False widow claims were risky and potentially criminal, but for women who had no other options, the risks were sometimes worth the advantages widow status provided. Professor Hannawalt's research reveals that widows in medieval society occupied a unique legal and social position. Unlike unmarried women, widows had legal standing. They could own property, make contracts, operate businesses, appear in courts. Unlike married women, widows weren't under their husband's authority and had rights to control their own affairs. Society viewed widows sympathetically rather than with suspicion, seeing them as women who had fulfilled their proper roles as wives and who deserved respect and support after their husbands' deaths. Widows could remarry if they chose, but they also had socially acceptable option to remain unmarried without facing the stigma that attached to women who had never married. According to Professor Hannawalt, the advantages of widow status meant that some never-married women falsely claimed to be widows, inventing dead husbands and constructing widow identities that gave them legal rights and social acceptance they couldn't access as unmarried women. A woman might move to a new town where no one knew her history and present herself as a widow, claiming her husband died in war, from plague, or in some other plausible manner that explained his absence and the lack of anyone who knew him. If the false widow claim was accepted, the woman could then operate as widows did, owning property, running businesses, living independently without facing the suspicion and restrictions that affected acknowledged spinsters. Professor Hannawalt's research reveals that successful false widow claims required careful planning and consistent maintenance of the deception. Women who claimed to be widows needed to be able to answer questions about their supposed husbands, where they met, when they married, how the husband died, whether there were children. They needed to avoid situations where their claims might be investigated too closely, and they needed to avoid remarriage, since marriage would require documentation that would reveal the false widow claim. Despite these challenges, evidence suggests that some women successfully maintained false widow identities for years or even decades, gaining benefits of widow status through sustained deception. But false widow claims were also risky. If discovered, women who falsely claimed to be widows could face prosecution for fraud, could be expelled from towns or guilds, could lose property they had acquired under false pretenses. In some cases, suspicious community members investigated women's widow claims, questioned their stories, sought evidence that their supposed husbands had actually existed. Women caught in false widow claims faced not just legal consequences, but also social ostracism and moral condemnation for their deception. Think about what false widow claims reveal about unmarried women's desperation and ingenuity. Women were willing to maintain elaborate lies for years, risking serious consequences if discovered, because the alternative of acknowledged unmarried status was even worse. The false widow claim demonstrates both the substantial advantages widows enjoyed compared to never-married women, and the lengths unmarried women would go to access those advantages. And the fact that the deception was sometimes necessary and successful shows how much medieval women's rights and opportunities depended on marital status rather than on their actual capabilities or needs. Let me tell you about the fourth survival strategy, working in one of the few trades that accepted women workers. According to research by Professor Mary Ann Kowaleski from Fordham University, whose work examines medieval women's work, certain occupations, brewing, textile production, retail trade, domestic service, prostitution employed substantial numbers of women, including unmarried women. Working in these trades allowed some unmarried women to support themselves, though the work was often poorly paid, legally precarious, and socially stigmatized. Professor Kowaleski's research reveals that brewing was one of the most important occupations for medieval unmarried women, particularly in England. Brewing ale was considered women's work, an extension of household food preparation, and many women brewed ale both for their own households and for sale. Unmarried women could work as brewsters, commercial ale producers, supporting themselves through brewing and selling ale to neighbours, to taverns, to markets. Brewing provided income that allowed some unmarried women to live independently. Though the work was hard, the profits often modest, and the occupation increasingly faced competition from male-dominated beer brewing in the later medieval period. According to Professor Kowaleski, textile production employed large numbers of women in various capacities: spinning, weaving, embroidery, dressmaking, laundry work. Unmarried women worked in textile trades both independently and as employees in larger workshops. The work was generally poorly paid. Spinning in particular was notorious for providing barely subsistence wages, but it was legal, socially acceptable, and available to women in most communities. Unmarried women who could sew or spin could usually find some work, though whether that work provided sufficient income for independent survival varied greatly. Professor Kowaleski's research reveals that retail trade offered opportunities for some unmarried women, particularly widows who inherited shops from husbands, but also some never-married women who established small businesses. Women operated market stalls, selling food, cloth, household items, and various other goods. They ran taverns, bakeries, and other retail establishments. But women in retail faced legal restrictions and economic discrimination. Guilds often prohibited or limited women's participation. Male competitors sometimes claimed women were taking work that belonged to men, and women retailers often faced harassment and theft that male retailers didn't experience to the same degree. Domestic service employed enormous numbers of unmarried women throughout medieval period. Young women worked as servants in wealthier households, earning wages and receiving room and board in exchange for cooking, cleaning, childcare, and various other domestic labours. Service provided unmarried women with employment and with housing and food, but it also meant living in others' households, being subject to employers' authority, and sometimes to sexual harassment or exploitation, and having little opportunity to accumulate savings or to establish independent households of their own. Think about these occupations and what they reveal about unmarried women's economic options. The trades that employed women were generally extensions of domestic work, brewing, cooking, cleaning, textile production, childcare work, that was seen as naturally feminine and therefore acceptable for women to perform. But the same work was valued less and paid less than male-dominated occupations. Unmarried women who worked in these trades could sometimes earn enough for bare survival, but accumulating wealth or achieving real economic security remained extremely difficult, and even these limited opportunities were under constant threat from male competitors, guild restrictions, and social prejudices against women working independently. Now let me tell you about the fifth survival strategy: forming households with other unmarried women. According to research by Professor Judith Bennett, some unmarried women survived by pooling resources with other unmarried women, living together in shared households where they could divide living costs, share domestic labour, provide mutual support and protection, and present themselves as respectable households, rather than as isolated, vulnerable individuals. These households of unmarried women existed in grey areas of social acceptability. They weren't illegal or openly condemned, but they were viewed with suspicion and didn't have the clear legitimacy of beguinages or convents. Professor Bennett's research reveals that households of unmarried women appeared in various forms in medieval records. Sometimes multiple women who worked in the same trade lived together, several Brewsters sharing a house, multiple spinners pooling resources, groups of laundresses working and living communally. Other times, women who were related, sisters, cousins, aunts and nieces, formed households together after fathers or husbands died, or when none of the women married. These family-based households of unmarried women were more socially acceptable than households of unrelated women, though they still attracted more suspicion than households headed by men. According to Professor Bennett, households of unmarried women provided practical advantages for women trying to survive independently. Sharing housing costs meant each woman needed less income to afford shelter. Sharing domestic labor meant women could spend more time on income-generating work and less time on cooking, cleaning, and household maintenance. Living with other women provided safety and protection that isolated women didn't have. Protection from physical attacks, from exploitation, from the many dangers that threatened women living alone. And shared households provided companionship and emotional support that helped unmarried women cope with the social isolation and stigma they faced. But households of unmarried women also faced significant challenges and suspicions. Authorities and neighbours viewed such households as abnormal and potentially disorderly. Women living together without male supervision were suspected of sexual impropriety, of practicing witchcraft, of plotting antisocial activities. Households of unmarried women often faced harassment from neighbours, investigation by authorities, and difficulty in maintaining themselves against social pressure to dissolve, and for the women to marry or join more conventional living arrangements. Professor Bennett's research includes specific examples of households of unmarried women that appear in medieval records. One particularly detailed case involves 3 sisters in 15th century England who inherited their father's brewing business and lived together running the brewery for more than 20 years, never marrying despite social pressure and numerous marriage proposals. They successfully maintained their business and their household, earning respect in their community through their brewing skills and their charitable activities. But records also show they faced regular rumours and suspicions, were investigated several times by local authorities for various alleged misconduct, and had to carefully maintain appearances of respectability to avoid harassment. Think about households of unmarried women and what they represent. These were women creating alternative family structures, choosing to build lives with other women rather than with husbands. They were demonstrating that women could support and care for each other, could create stable households without male presence, could be productive members of communities without conforming to expectations that women should be under male authority. But the suspicion and harassment these households faced also demonstrates how threatening women's independence was to social order that depended on women being incorporated into male-headed households through marriage. Let me tell you about the 6th survival strategy: more desperate and dangerous turning to prostitution. According to research by Professor Ruth Mazo-Karras from the University of Minnesota, whose work examines medieval prostitution, sex work provided income for substantial numbers of unmarried women who had no other options for survival. Prostitution was stigmatized, dangerous, and often barely provided subsistence. But for unmarried women who couldn't find other work, or who couldn't survive on the meagre wages available in respectable women's trades, prostitution was sometimes the only alternative to starvation. Professor Karras's research reveals that medieval prostitution existed in various forms ranging from highly organized urban brothels to individual women working independently on streets or from their homes. In some cities, authorities licensed and regulated prostitution, designating specific brothels or districts where sex work was permitted and attempting to control prostitutes' movements and activities. In other places, prostitution was officially illegal but tolerated in practice, with authorities periodically cracking down on prostitutes but generally allowing the trade to continue. The legal and social status of prostitution varied considerably across time and place. According to Professor Karras, women entered prostitution for various reasons, but economic necessity was overwhelmingly the most common motivation. Some prostitutes were unmarried women who couldn't find other work or who found that other available work paid so little they couldn't survive on the wages. Others were widows who turned to prostitution after their husbands died and they had no other means of support. Some were women who had been sexually assaulted or seduced and then abandoned and who found that their loss of virginity and their resulting unchastity made them unmarriageable and excluded them from respectable work. The common thread was economic desperation. Prostitution was what women did when all better options had been exhausted. Professor Karas's research reveals that prostitution was dangerous and exploitative work. Prostitutes faced violence from clients, harassment from authorities, exploitation by pimps and brothel keepers who took large portions of their earnings. They faced high risks of disease, injury, and pregnancy with limited access to medical care or to ways of controlling reproduction. They faced social stigma that marked them permanently. Former prostitutes found it nearly impossible to marry or to enter respectable occupations even if they left sex work. And many prostitutes remained desperately poor despite their work, earning barely enough to survive and having few opportunities to save money or improve their situations. But prostitution also provided some unmarried women with income and with rough form of independence. Prostitutes earned money through their own work rather than being dependent on family members or on employers who might exploit them in different ways. Some prostitutes managed to save money and eventually leave prostitution, buying property or establishing small businesses. A few prostitutes, particularly high-status courtesans in urban centres, accumulated substantial wealth and exercised considerable influence. Though these successful prostitutes were rare exceptions rather than typical cases, think about prostitution as survival strategy for unmarried women and what it reveals about medieval women's options. That sex work was a survival strategy, that women turned to prostitution as alternative to starvation, demonstrates how limited were the respectable options available. Unmarried women who couldn't find other work that paid living wages faced choices between prostitution, destitution, or death. The existence of prostitution as option for unmarried women reveals the failure of medieval society to provide legitimate paths to survival for women who didn't or couldn't marry. Let me tell you about why women refused marriage in the first place, because understanding their motivations helps explain why they were willing to accept the enormous costs of unmarried life. According to research by Professor Diane Elliott from Northwestern University, whose work examines medieval sexuality and gender, women refused marriage for diverse and complex reasons, some ideological, some practical, some personal. Contrary to stereotypes that portrayed unmarried women as bitter rejects who couldn't find husbands, many women actively chose unmarried life, despite having marriage opportunities, judging that the costs of marriage outweighed its benefits. Professor Elliott's research reveals that some women refused marriage for religious reasons, believing that virginity and celibacy were spiritually superior to marriage, and that dedicating their lives to God was more important than dedicating their lives to husbands and children. Medieval Christianity taught that virginity was highest state, that those who remained virgins for religious reasons would receive special heavenly rewards, that marriage was acceptable but inferior to consecrated celibacy. Women who took these teachings seriously might refuse marriage, not from inability to find husbands, but from genuine religious conviction that remaining unmarried was spiritually preferable. According to Professor Elliott, other women refused marriage for intellectual reasons, recognizing that marriage would consume their time and energy in household management and childbearing and would leave them little opportunity for education, reading, creative work, or intellectual pursuits. Women who had access to education, usually daughters of wealthy families, or girls who were educated in convents, sometimes valued their learning highly enough that they refused marriage to preserve time and freedom for continued study. The scholar and writer Christine de Pizan, widowed young, chose not to remarry partly because remaining unmarried allowed her to continue her writing career which remarriage would have ended. Professor Elliott's research reveals that some women refused marriage for practical economic reasons, calculating that they would be better off financially remaining unmarried than marrying men who couldn't adequately support them, or who would consume or waste resources women brought to marriages. Wealthy women who inherited substantial property sometimes remained unmarried rather than risk losing control of their property to husbands who would gain legal ownership through marriage. Women who had established successful businesses sometimes refused marriage because marriage would transfer their businesses to husbands' control and might end their ability to work independently. Other women refused marriage to avoid specific unacceptable marriage, partners their families wanted them to marry. A woman whose family tried to arrange marriage to a much older man, to a man with reputation for violence or cruelty, to a man she found physically repulsive or morally objectionable, might refuse the marriage, even if that meant remaining permanently unmarried. Some women refused marriages that would require moving far from their families, leaving communities they loved, or entering situations they feared. The refusal was sometimes about rejecting particular bad matches rather than rejecting marriage itself, but the result was the same woman who remained unmarried because they found proposed marriages unacceptable. Think about these diverse motivations for refusing marriage. Women weren't refusing marriage only because they were damaged, difficult, or unable to find husbands. They were making reasoned judgments about what kinds of lives they wanted, what costs they were willing to pay, what values mattered most to them. A woman who refused marriage to preserve her intellectual work was valuing education and creativity over security and social acceptance. A woman who refused marriage to avoid an abusive husband was valuing safety over economic security. A woman who refused marriage for religious reasons was valuing spiritual commitments over family and social expectations. These were active choices, thoughtful decisions, not passive failures to conform to social expectations. Now let me tell you about the psychological and emotional dimensions of unmarried life in medieval society, because refusing marriage created not just practical challenges, but also profound psychological burdens. According to research by Professor Diane Elliott, unmarried women faced constant messages that they were failures, that they were unnatural, that something was fundamentally wrong with them. This social messaging created psychological stresses that unmarried women had to manage alongside the practical challenges of survival. Professor Elliott's research reveals that unmarried women internalized social judgments to varying degrees. Some women accepted society's view that marriage was natural and proper and struggled with feelings of inadequacy, failure or incompleteness because they hadn't married. Their writings express loneliness, self-doubt, questioning of their choices, grief over lives they didn't live. These women managed to survive unmarried, but the psychological costs were high. They lived with chronic feelings that they had failed at life's fundamental purposes. According to Professor Elliott, other unmarried women rejected social judgments about their status, insisting that unmarried life was legitimate, valuable, and potentially superior to marriage. Religious women argued that virginity was holy estate and that their unmarried status reflected their spiritual superiority rather than their failure. Intellectual women argued that unmarried life gave them freedom for study and creative work that married women were denied. Pragmatic women argued that remaining unmarried was rational choice given the alternatives available to them. These women developed counter-narratives that validated their choices and their lives, even when society condemned them. Professor Elliott's research reveals that unmarried women often formed intense emotional bonds with each other, friendships, partnerships, communities that provided emotional support and validation that broader society denied them. Women living in beguinages or in convents developed close relationships with each other, relationships that sometimes had romantic or erotic dimensions, but that at minimum provided emotional intimacy and support. Unmarried women living in secular society often maintained close friendships with other unmarried women, relationships that helped both parties cope with social isolation and stigma. Think about the emotional burdens of unmarried life and what they reveal about the costs of refusing marriage. You are living in a society that tells you constantly that you are wrong, that you failed, that you are unnatural and pitiable. You face this messaging from family members, from neighbours, from religious authorities, from popular culture. Managing these psychological burdens required either internalizing the pain and living with feelings of inadequacy, or developing strong countervailing beliefs that rejected social judgments. Either path had costs: chronic psychological pain, or the difficulty of maintaining beliefs that contradicted everything your society told you was true. Let me tell you about specific legal vulnerabilities unmarried women faced, and how those vulnerabilities shaped their survival strategies. According to research by Professor Marjorie McIntosh from the University of Colorado, whose work examines medieval law and society, unmarried women had precarious legal status in most medieval jurisdictions. Unlike widows who had some legal rights and unlike married women who were legally represented by their husbands, unmarried women often had no legal standing, couldn't bring cases in court, couldn't enforce contracts, couldn't defend their property rights, and were vulnerable to various forms of legal exploitation. Professor McIntosh's research reveals that legal systems varied across medieval Europe, but common patterns disadvantaged unmarried women throughout the continent. In many jurisdictions, unmarried women couldn't own property land. They reverted to male relatives. Property they purchased wasn't legally theirs. In court systems, unmarried women's testimony was given less weight than men's testimony, or even than married women's testimony. Legal documents often required unmarried women to have male guardians who would represent them in legal matters, but guardians often exploited their positions to their own advantage, rather than protecting the women they supposedly represented. According to Professor McIntosh, sexual assault of unmarried women was treated less seriously than assault of married women or virgins from respectable families. An unmarried woman who was raped often found courts unsympathetic, treating the rape as less serious, because unmarried women were already sexually suspect, and because their chastity was presumed less valuable than that of virgins or married women. This legal reality meant that unmarried women were extremely vulnerable to sexual violence and had little recourse when assaulted. Professor McIntosh's research reveals that unmarried women also faced legal harassment in forms that didn't affect married women or men. Authorities could force unmarried women to leave towns or communities, judging them as potential sources of disorder or immorality. Unmarried women could be compelled to enter service in others' households, essentially forced into dependent positions, even if they were capable of supporting themselves independently. And unmarried women faced legal penalties for various behaviours that weren't illegal for men or for married women: living independently, travelling without male companions, working in certain occupations. Think about these legal vulnerabilities and how they shaped unmarried women's survival strategies. You couldn't rely on legal system to protect your property, your safety, or your rights. You needed to develop informal protections, communities that would support you, patrons who would intervene on your behalf, reputations that would make others think twice before exploiting you. The legal vulnerabilities meant that surviving as unmarried woman required not just economic resources, but also social resources, networks of support that could substitute for legal protections you couldn't access. Now, let me tell you about unmarried women who disguise themselves as men to access opportunities that were denied to women. According to research by Professor Valerie Hotchkiss from the University of Illinois, whose work examines cross-dressing in medieval Europe, some unmarried women chose to live as men, binding their breasts, cutting their hair, dressing in men's clothing. and adopting male identities that allowed them to work in male-dominated trades, to travel freely, to escape the restrictions that limited women's lives. Cross-dressing was extremely risky. Discovery could lead to execution in some jurisdictions, but for some women, the risks were preferable to the constraints of acknowledged female life. Professor Hotchkiss's research reveals that most documented cases of medieval women cross-dressing involved religious contexts. Women who disguised themselves as men to enter male monasteries, or to live as hermit monks. These religious cross-dressers were often discovered only when they died and their bodies revealed their sex. Some religious cross-dressers were later canonized as saints, their cross-dressing interpreted as evidence of their holy determination to pursue religious life, despite obstacles. But the religious framing probably obscures many cases of secular cross-dressing that went unrecorded because women living as men in secular contexts weren't subjects of religious hagiography. According to Professor Hotchkiss, women who successfully maintained male identities had to manage numerous practical challenges. They needed to urinate and defecate without revealing their anatomy, a challenge that required careful management of bodily functions and avoidance of situations where their bodies might be seen. They needed to avoid intimate physical contact that might reveal their body's actual form. They had to master masculine behaviors, speech patterns, and social interactions, convincingly enough that others wouldn't become suspicious, and they lived with constant fear of discovery and with knowledge that revelation of their sex would likely result in severe punishment. Professor Hotchkiss's research includes several specific cases of discovered female cross-dressers. One well-documented case involves a woman in 14th century London who lived as a man for more than a decade, working as a craftsman and even marrying another woman before being discovered and brought to trial for fraud and deceit. Court records reveal both her sophisticated management of male identity and the severity of punishment she faced when discovered: public humiliation, flogging, and banishment from the city. Her case demonstrates both the possibilities and the dangers of cross-dressing as survival strategy. Think about what cross-dressing as survival strategy reveals about constraints women faced. Some women found living as men, with all the risks and difficulties that entailed, preferable to living openly as women. They judged that the constant fear of discovery, the practical challenges of maintaining male disguise, the risk of severe punishment if caught, all of these costs were worth paying to access opportunities that being female denied them. The choice to cross-dress represented extreme form of refusal to accept restrictions on women's lives, willingness to take extraordinary risks to escape those restrictions. Let me tell you about unmarried women and property ownership, and how some women used strategic property management to create financial security outside marriage. According to research by Professor Judith Bennett, some unmarried women, particularly wealthy women who inherited property from fathers or other male relatives, managed to maintain property ownership and to live off property income, despite legal systems that generally denied unmarried women property rights. Successful property ownership required sophisticated legal maneuvering, reliable allies, and often involved trusts, guardianships, and other legal arrangements that protected women's property from seizure. Professor Bennett's research reveals that property-owning unmarried women faced constant pressure to marry, because marriage would transfer their property to husbands, enriching husbands and their families. Wealthy unmarried women received marriage proposals not from genuine suitors, but from fortune hunters who wanted access to women's property more than they wanted the women themselves. Resisting these marriages required both personal determination and support from families who would defend women's right to remain unmarried, rather than pressuring them to marry for family advantage. According to Professor Bennett, some unmarried women who inherited property established households that functioned essentially as minor aristocratic estates, with the unmarried women serving as effective heads of household, despite their female status. They employed servants, managed agricultural production, collected rents, administered justice over tenants, and exercised many of the functions male property owners performed. Their success in these roles demonstrated that women were fully capable of property management and estate administration, giving lie to arguments that women needed husbands to manage property they owned. Professor Bennett's research includes a remarkable case of an unmarried woman in 15th century England who inherited substantial property from her father and managed it successfully for more than 30 years, refusing numerous marriage proposals and defending her right to remain unmarried against family pressure and legal challenges. She employed a largely female household staff, patronized local religious institutions, involved herself in local politics and justice administration, and became an influential figure in her region. Her will, which distributed her property among various female relatives, religious institutions, and charitable causes, demonstrated both her wealth and her determination that her property support other women rather than being absorbed into male-controlled estates through marriage. Think about property-owning unmarried women and what they represent. These were women exercising authority, managing complex economic operations, wielding influence, all things that supposedly required male governance. Their success proved that women could perform all the functions property ownership entailed. But their rarity also demonstrates how few women had opportunity to inherit and maintain property ownership. Most unmarried women had no property, couldn't inherit equally with brothers, and faced legal systems that took any property they did manage to acquire. The few propertied unmarried women were exceptions that proved how constrained most women's economic situations were. Now let me tell you about the role of education in enabling some unmarried women to support themselves, because educated women had opportunities that illiterate women lacked. According to research by Professor Eileen Power from Cambridge University, whose classic work examines medieval women's education, some unmarried women who received education, usually in convents or from family members, used their literacy and learning to work as teachers, as scribes copying manuscripts, as medical practitioners, or in other occupations that required education. Educational opportunities for women were limited, but the women who did gain education often found that learning opened survival possibilities that wouldn't otherwise have existed. Professor Power's research reveals that teaching provided income for some educated unmarried women. Women taught children basic literacy and numeracy, taught girls domestic skills and needlework, taught music and singing. Teaching wasn't highly paid and wasn't particularly respected, but it was socially acceptable work for unmarried women, and it provided income that made independent survival possible. Some unmarried women established small schools in their homes, teaching several pupils and earning enough to support themselves modestly. According to Professor Power, manuscript copying employed small numbers of educated unmarried women, particularly in religious contexts, where nuns copied manuscripts for their convent's libraries or for sale. The work required literacy, careful handwriting, and often knowledge of Latin. Women scribes produced religious texts, classical works, legal documents, and various other manuscripts. The work was painstaking and often poorly paid, but it was respectable and it utilized women's education in productive ways. Professor Power's research reveals that medical practice provided opportunities for some educated unmarried women who learned healing arts from family members or from apprenticeships with other practitioners. Women practiced as midwives, attending births and caring for women's reproductive health. They practiced as herbalists, preparing medicines from plants and treating various ailments. And some women practiced more general medicine, diagnosing and treating a range of conditions. Medical practice wasn't formally regulated in most medieval jurisdictions, allowing women to practice alongside men, though women practitioners generally served primarily female clients and earned less than male practitioners. Think about education's role in expanding unmarried women's options. Literacy and learning weren't just culturally valuable, they were economically valuable, opening occupations that illiterate women couldn't access. But the fact that education provided such advantages also highlights how educational inequality constrained most women's options. The vast majority of medieval women were illiterate, had no formal education, and therefore couldn't access the few better-paid occupations that required learning. Educational opportunity was limited by class, by geography, by family attitudes, by numerous factors that most women couldn't control. The educated, unmarried women who supported themselves through teaching or scribing or medical practice were privileged minorities whose opportunities depended on advantages most women lacked. Let me tell you about unmarried women and religious heresy, because some women who refused marriage and who lived outside conventional religious structures were accused of heresy and faced persecution. According to research by Professor Walter Simons, religious authorities were deeply suspicious of women who claimed religious authority or who practiced unconventional forms of spirituality outside ecclesiastical control. Unmarried women who preached, who claimed mystical visions, who gathered followers, or who criticized church practices faced accusations of heresy and risked being burned at the stake. Professor Simons' research reveals that the line between acceptable women's religious activity and heretical activity was unclear and shifting. Some women mystics who had visions and wrote about their spiritual experiences were celebrated and even canonized, while others with similar experiences were condemned as heretics. Some communities of religious women, like Beguines, were tolerated or even supported by church authorities, while other, apparently similar communities were suppressed as heretical. Women's religious activities existed in uncertain legal and theological territory, where their status could change based on political circumstances, personalities of local bishops, or shifts in theological fashions. According to Professor Simons, accusations of heresy were sometimes motivated by genuine theological concerns, but were often also motivated by gender politics. Church authorities who believed women should be under male supervision and who were threatened by women's religious independence used heresy accusations as tools for controlling women who challenged gender norms. Unmarried women who lived independently, who claimed spiritual authority, who attracted followers were particularly likely to face heresy accusations because they represented multiple challenges to established hierarchies: gender hierarchy, clerical hierarchy, and social hierarchy. Professor Simons' research includes several cases of unmarried women executed for heresy. One well-known case involves Marguerite Porete, a Beguine from northern France who wrote a mystical text called The Mirror of Simple Souls in the late 13th century. Church authorities condemned her book as heretical, and when she refused to recant her teachings, she was burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. Her execution served as warning to other religious women about the risks of theological independence and public teaching. Yet her book, which claimed that advanced souls could achieve unity with God that transcended church authority and religious law, was later copied and circulated by others who valued her mystical teachings, despite official condemnation. Think about heresy accusations and executions, and what they reveal about the dangers unmarried women faced when they claimed religious authority or spiritual independence. Marguerite Porete wasn't accused of witchcraft or sexual immorality. She was accused of heresy, of teaching incorrect theology, of challenging church authority. Her crime was claiming that her mystical experiences gave her insight into divine truth that didn't require validation by male clergy. That claim was threatening enough that authorities killed her to silence her teachings. The violence of the response demonstrates how fundamentally threatening were women who refused both marriage and conventional religious authority. Now, let me tell you about aging and death for unmarried women, because the challenges of unmarried life intensified as women grew older. According to research by Professor Shulamith Shahar from Tel Aviv University, whose work examines old age in medieval period, elderly unmarried women faced particular vulnerabilities. As they aged, their ability to work and earn income declined. They might have no family members obligated to care for them, and they faced social prejudices that associated elderly unmarried women with witchcraft, evil magic, and general malevolence. Professor Shahar's research reveals that some unmarried women prepared for old age by joining religious communities later in life, or by entering hospitals or charitable institutions that cared for elderly poor. These institutions provided basic food and shelter, but often required residents to surrender any property or savings they had, leaving elderly women completely dependent on institutional charity. Women who entered such institutions essentially gave up autonomy in exchange for survival, a trade that became necessary when age made other survival strategies impossible. According to Professor Shahar, other elderly unmarried women continued working as long as physically possible, doing progressively less demanding work as their strength failed. A woman who had brewed ale might shift to spinning when she could no longer manage brewing's physical demands. A spinner whose eyesight failed might do laundry work or simple household tasks. Women who could no longer work at all became completely dependent on charity, from religious institutions, from guilds or communities they belonged to, from former employers or patrons, or from networks of people who had known them when they were younger and productive. Professor Shahar's research reveals that elderly unmarried women faced accusations of witchcraft at rates much higher than other demographic groups. The stereotype of the witch as elderly unmarried woman reflected and reinforced prejudices against women who lived outside male authority throughout their lives. Elderly unmarried women who were poor, who were dependent on others' charity, who were physically unattractive by conventional standards, who were perhaps mentally confused or eccentric in ways age might create. These women were particularly vulnerable to being targeted as witches during periods of witch prosecution. The deaths of unmarried women often received little notice and little ceremony. Women who died in religious communities received proper burial and religious rites, but unmarried women who died without property, without families, and without institutional affiliations might be buried in unmarked graves or in sections of cemeteries reserved for the poor and marginalized. Their deaths went unrecorded in most cases, their lives leaving little historical trace beyond occasional mentions in records of criminal proceedings, charitable institutions, or guild regulations. Think about aging and death for unmarried women and what the trajectories reveal about the full arc of unmarried life. The challenges that unmarried women faced throughout their lives intensified as they aged and lost capacity to work and provide for themselves. Old age for unmarried women often meant poverty, dependence, vulnerability, and social prejudice. Yet despite these grim prospects, women still chose or accepted unmarried life, judging that even with terrible later years, remaining unmarried was preferable to marriages they found intolerable. The willingness to face difficult old age rather than marry demonstrates how serious were the objections women had to marriages available to them. Let me tell you about the economic calculations women made when deciding whether to marry, because refusing marriage wasn't always irrational choice or emotional rejection, but was sometimes reasoned economic decision. According to research by Professor Mavis Mate from the University of Oregon, whose work examines medieval women's economic lives, some women, particularly those with property or reliable income sources, calculated that they would be financially better off remaining unmarried than marrying men who would gain control over their property and income. The economic logic that made marriage seem inevitable for poor women sometimes made remaining unmarried the smarter choice for propertied women. Professor Mate's research reveals that women who inherited property or who established successful businesses often found that marriage would mean losing control over assets they had managed successfully on their own. A woman who inherited a manor or a workshop could operate it independently, keep all profits, make all decisions about management and investment. If she married, her husband would gain legal control over the property, would make all management decisions, would control all income, and might manage the property incompetently, or might sell it, or give it away despite her objections. From purely economic perspective, remaining unmarried and maintaining control often made more sense than marrying and surrendering control. According to Professor Mate, wealthy unmarried women also avoided the financial risks marriage created. Risks that husbands would accumulate debts that wives would be responsible for paying. Risks that husbands would make bad investments or business decisions that would squander family wealth. Risks that husbands would spend money supporting mistresses or illegitimate children. Historical records contain numerous cases of women whose fathers or brothers had accumulated debts and whose creditors tried to seize family property, and numerous cases of men who squandered inherited wealth through gambling, poor business decisions, or simply excessive spending. Unmarried women who maintained their own property avoided these risks. Professor Mate's research includes specific case studies of women who made explicit economic calculations about marriage. One particularly detailed case involves a wealthy widow in 14th century England who received multiple marriage proposals after her husband died, including proposals from men of higher social status than her late husband. She rejected all proposals, writing in letters to family members that she preferred to remain unmarried. Because I have sufficient property to maintain myself in comfort and dignity, I have demonstrated my capacity to manage my estates effectively, and I see no advantage in surrendering my property and my authority to any man who might manage less well than I do myself. Her reasoning was purely economic. She calculated that marriage would cost her more in lost autonomy and potential mismanagement than it would gain her in social status or companionship. Think about the economic calculations women made about marriage. For poor women, marriage usually made economic sense because husbands' earning capacity typically exceeded women's limited opportunities for independent income. But for propertied women, the economic calculus was different. Marriage meant giving up control over property, accepting risks of husbands' poor management or debts, potentially seeing family wealth that had been carefully accumulated over generations squandered by incompetent or irresponsible husbands. From this perspective, remaining unmarried and maintaining control over one's own property was rational economic choice, not romantic failure or religious calling, but hard-headed business decision. Now, let me tell you about family reactions when women refused marriage. Because families whose daughters rejected marriages faced both practical problems and social embarrassment. According to research by Professor Barbara Hannawalt, families typically pressured daughters to marry both to form beneficial alliances with other families and to remove the economic burden of supporting adult daughters. When daughters refused marriages, families had to decide whether to accept daughters' choices and continue supporting them, or to use various forms of coercion to force marriages to proceed. Professor Hannawalt's research reveals that family reactions varied based on factors including the daughter's age, the advantageousness of the proposed marriage, the family's economic situation, and the personalities and relationships within families. Some families accepted daughters' refusals, particularly if daughters had reasonable objections to proposed matches, or if families could afford to continue supporting unmarried daughters. Other families responded with intense pressure, including emotional manipulation, threats to cut off financial support, or actual physical coercion to force daughters into unwanted marriages. According to Professor Hannawalt, some families used convents as solutions when daughters refused marriage, placing daughters in religious houses essentially as a way of removing them from family responsibilities, without the social embarrassment of having unmarried daughters living at home indefinitely. This arrangement solved families' problems but didn't necessarily reflect daughters' religious callings. Some women forced into convents against their wills later tried to leave or to have their vows annulled, arguing that vows made under family pressure weren't valid. These cases created legal and theological complications about whether religious vows required genuine consent or whether family authority could override individual choice. Professor Hannawalt's research includes heartbreaking cases of family conflicts over daughters' marriage refusals. One well-documented case from 14th century Italy involves a young woman who refused to marry the man her father selected, a much older, wealthy merchant. The father responded by confining his daughter to her room, denying her food, and eventually beating her severely. The daughter appealed to local church authorities, who investigated and eventually intervened, ruling that the father couldn't force marriage against his daughter's will. But the intervention came only after months of family conflict and abuse, and the daughter's relationship with her father was permanently destroyed. Think about family dynamics around marriage refusals and what they reveal about marriage's functions in medieval society. Marriage wasn't just about individuals' happiness or even about procreation. It was about family alliances, property transfers, social positioning. When daughters refused marriages, they were disrupting family strategies, potentially costing families valuable alliances or financial advantages. The intense family pressure women faced to marry demonstrates that marriage decisions weren't really individual choices, but were family decisions where daughters' preferences were supposed to be subordinated to family interests. Women who insisted on refusing marriages they found unacceptable were asserting individual autonomy against family authority in ways that fundamentally challenged how medieval families operated. Let me tell you about unmarried women and urban life, because cities offered opportunities for unmarried women that rural areas generally didn't provide. According to research by Professor Martha Howell from Columbia University, whose work examines medieval urban economies, cities employed unmarried women in various crafts and trades, provided more anonymous environments where women could live independently with less social scrutiny than rural communities imposed, and often had charitable institutions that could support destitute unmarried women. Urban life wasn't easy for unmarried women, but it was generally more viable than rural life. Professor Howell's research reveals that medieval cities had higher percentages of unmarried women than rural areas, partly because cities attracted unmarried women seeking opportunities that didn't exist in villages. Young women migrated to cities to work as domestic servants, as textile workers in food production and retail trades, and in various other occupations. Some of these women eventually married urban men, but others remained unmarried throughout their lives, building urban careers and lives outside marriage. The concentration of unmarried women in cities created communities and networks that wouldn't have been possible in rural areas where unmarried women were more isolated. According to Professor Howell, urban guilds and craft organizations sometimes admitted women members, providing unmarried women with professional identities and organizational support that rural unmarried women lacked. Women could join guilds as silk workers, as gold thread makers, as brewers, as retailers, gaining guild membership that gave them legitimacy and protection. Guild membership didn't make unmarried women equal to male guild members. Women often paid higher membership fees, faced more restrictions on their activities, and received less support from guilds when they faced problems. But guild membership gave unmarried women official status and connected them to organizations that could provide assistance and defense when needed. Professor Howell's research reveals that cities also had more developed charitable systems than rural areas, including hospitals, almshouses, and charitable funds that could support destitute people, including unmarried women. Urban charitable institutions weren't generous and often imposed conditions on recipients, requiring them to perform labor, to attend religious services, to accept supervision of their behavior, but they provided safety nets that could prevent absolute destitution. Unmarried women who fell into poverty in cities had institutional options that simply didn't exist in rural areas where charity was less organized and less reliable. Think about what urban environments offered unmarried women compared to rural life. Cities provided employment opportunities, anonymity that reduced social surveillance and judgment, communities of other unmarried women, guild memberships that conferred status and protection, and charitable institutions that could prevent absolute destitution. These advantages explain why unmarried women migrated to cities, and why cities had higher proportions of unmarried women than rural areas. The urban environment didn't make unmarried life easy or comfortable, but it made unmarried survival more feasible than it was in rural contexts, where opportunities were fewer and social control was tighter. Now let me tell you about how some unmarried women turned their status into advantage by serving as trusted intermediaries and confidantes for married women. According to research by Professor Judith Bennett, unmarried women sometimes occupied unique social positions where they could interact with both men and women, could move between different social circles, and could provide services that married women couldn't easily provide because of their obligations to husbands and children. These social intermediary roles provided some unmarried women with income, status, and social networks that partially compensated for the disadvantages of unmarried status. Professor Bennett's research reveals that unmarried women sometimes served as go-betweens in marriage negotiations, as mediators in family disputes, as confidantes for married women who needed someone to talk to about problems in their marriages. These roles capitalized on unmarried women's supposed neutrality. They weren't representing husbands' interests or their own family's interests, but could supposedly provide objective advice and assistance. Whether unmarried women actually were more neutral than married women or male advisors is questionable, but the perception that they might be gave some unmarried women valuable social roles. According to Professor Bennett, some unmarried women also served as moneylenders, taking advantage of the fact that they controlled whatever money and property they had without having to account to husbands for how they deployed resources. Unmarried women who had accumulated savings could lend money at interest, providing capital for others while earning income for themselves. Money lending was sometimes stigmatized, particularly when lenders charged high interest rates, but it provided income for unmarried women and gave them power and influence through the financial relationships they created with borrowers. Professor Bennett's research reveals that unmarried women also sometimes served as teachers and advisors for young women preparing for marriage, teaching them domestic skills, educating them about what to expect from marriage, counseling them about how to manage relationships with husbands and husbands' families. These teaching and advisory roles gave unmarried women status as experts despite their lack of marriage experience, and provided them with income and social connections that made unmarried life more viable. Think about these social intermediary roles and what they reveal about how some unmarried women turn disadvantage into advantage. Being unmarried meant lacking the security and status marriage provided, but it also meant having freedoms and flexibilities that married women didn't have. Some clever unmarried women capitalized on those freedoms, creating social and economic roles that wouldn't have been available to them if they had married. The intermediary positions demonstrate that unmarried women weren't only victims of their unmarried status, but were sometimes able to strategically deploy that status to create opportunities. Let me tell you about the intersection of class and unmarried status, because women's experiences of unmarried life varied dramatically based on economic class. According to research by Professor Marianne Kowaleski, wealthy unmarried women and poor unmarried women lived in almost completely different worlds, despite sharing unmarried status. Wealthy unmarried women had property that generated income, had families that supported them, had social status that provided protection. Poor unmarried women had to work for survival, had limited family support, and had little protection from exploitation and abuse. Professor Kowaleski's research reveals that wealthy unmarried women could maintain comfortable independent households, employ servants, patronize arts and religion, participate in social and political life, and exercise influence that exceeded what many married women could achieve. A wealthy unmarried woman like the heiress who managed her father's estates could live essentially as minor aristocrat with authority, comfort and respect that her wealth and property commanded. Her unmarried status was inconvenient and slightly embarrassing, but it didn't prevent her from living well or from wielding significant power. According to Professor Kowaleski, Middle-class unmarried women occupied more precarious positions. They might have modest property or business income that allowed independence, but they lacked the substantial wealth that would make unmarried life truly comfortable and secure. They had to balance maintenance of respectability, living quietly, avoiding scandals, demonstrating proper behavior, with economic necessity of working or managing property to support themselves. Their lives required careful navigation between claiming enough autonomy to survive independently and maintaining enough conformity to social expectations to avoid persecution. Professor Kowaleski's research reveals that poor unmarried women faced constant struggle for survival. They worked in poorly paid occupations, lived in inadequate housing, suffered from malnutrition and disease, and had almost no security or protection. Poor unmarried women couldn't afford to be particularly selective about work. They took whatever employment they could find, even if that meant dangerous or degrading work. And poor unmarried women who couldn't find adequate work faced destitution, prostitution, or death from poverty. Think about how class shaped experiences of unmarried life. When we talk about unmarried women refusing marriage, we're often talking primarily about women who had choices, women with property or education or family support that made refusing marriage possible. Poor women rarely had luxury of refusing marriage, because marriage to even a poor man usually represented economic improvement over independent poverty. The poor unmarried women who appear in historical records were usually women who couldn't marry, women without dowries, women with disabilities, women in communities where gender ratios made marriage impossible for all women, rather than women who chose unmarried life. Class fundamentally shaped whether unmarried status represented choice, with costs, or simply unavoidable fate. Now let me tell you about marriage resistance as religious calling, because distinguishing between women who refused marriage for practical reasons and women who refused marriage for genuinely religious motivations is complex. According to research by Professor Caroline Walker-Bynum, many medieval religious women wrote about their decisions to refuse marriage in terms of divine calling. They claimed that God had called them to virginity, that Christ himself was their spiritual spouse, that they couldn't possibly marry earthly men after being called to religious life. But historians debate whether these religious explanations represented actual spiritual experiences or were socially acceptable ways of framing decisions that had practical or personal motivations. Professor Bynum's research reveals that medieval Christianity provided theological framework that validated women's refusals of marriage in ways secular frameworks didn't. If you refused marriage because you didn't like the man your family selected, or because you wanted to preserve your property, or because you preferred independence to subordination to a husband, these reasons seemed selfish and socially disruptive. But if you refused marriage because God had called you to consecrated virginity, your refusal became religiously valid, even admirable. Religious language allowed women to frame refusals of marriage in terms that society had to respect rather than condemn. According to Professor Bynum, some women's religious callings seem completely genuine based on their writings and their life choices. Women like Hildegard of Bingen or Clare of Assisi wrote extensively about their spiritual experiences, about their sense of divine calling, about their mystical encounters with God that made earthly marriage unthinkable. Their religious devotion appears sincere and profound, not merely convenient excuse for refusing marriages, but other women's religious justifications for refusing marriage seem more strategic, more about finding acceptable language for personal preferences than about deep spiritual calling. Professor Bynum's research includes fascinating examples of women's own writings about their decisions to refuse marriage. One 13th century woman wrote that when her family tried to arrange her marriage, she prayed desperately that God would prevent the marriage, and on the day of the wedding ceremony, she developed sudden serious illness that postponed the wedding. She interpreted the illness as divine intervention saving her from marriage, and she persuaded her family to allow her to enter a convent instead. Whether her illness was psychosomatic response to her desire to avoid marriage or genuinely miraculous divine intervention depends on one's theological beliefs. But clearly she believed God had intervened to save her from marriage she didn't want, and that belief gave her religious justification for refusing marriage that her family accepted even though they had wanted the marriage to proceed. Think about religious calling as justification for refusing marriage and what it reveals about how women navigated social expectations. Religious language provided women with socially acceptable way to frame choices that otherwise would have been condemned as selfish or unnatural. Whether individual women's religious callings were sincere spiritual experiences or strategic uses of religious rhetoric is probably impossible to determine in many cases, and probably doesn't matter as much as recognizing that religious frameworks gave women language and legitimacy for choosing not to marry. The availability of religious justifications for refusing marriage meant that women had pathway for choosing unmarried life that society had to recognize as valid, even if society generally was women's natural destiny. As we come to the end of this journey through unmarried women's lives in medieval society, you might reflect on what these stories reveal about women's agency, determination, and creativity in the face of overwhelming social pressure to conform. You've learned tonight that marriage in medieval society wasn't just social custom or personal choice, but was enforced through legal structures, economic systems, and social pressures that made unmarried life extremely difficult, and that punished women who refused marriage. Yet substantial numbers of women, perhaps 10 to 20% of the female population, lived unmarried, finding ways to survive and sometimes even thrive, despite systems designed to force them into marriage. You've discovered the specific survival strategies unmarried women used, entering convents where religious life provided security and community, joining beguine communities that offered middle path between religious and secular life, falsely claiming to be widows to access widows' legal rights, working in trades that accepted women workers forming households with other unmarried women, and in desperate cases turning to prostitution when all other options failed. You've learned about the diverse motivations that led women to refuse marriage: religious conviction, intellectual ambition, practical economic calculation, rejection of specific unacceptable marriage partners. And you've learned about the psychological burdens, legal vulnerabilities, and physical dangers that unmarried women faced throughout their lives. You've also learned that unmarried women weren't passive victims, but were active agents who made choices, developed strategies, created communities, and built lives that had meaning and value despite society's insistence that women's only legitimate role was as wives and mothers. The women who entered convents and became abbesses, exercising authority over religious communities. The women who formed beguine communities, supporting themselves through work. The women who managed inherited property as effective heads of household. The women who taught or copied manuscripts or practiced medicine. All these women demonstrated capabilities that marriage would have suppressed, and that social beliefs about women claimed didn't exist. Thank you for spending this time learning about unmarried women in medieval society. You now understand that refusing marriage in medieval period wasn't simple matter of personal preference, but required accepting enormous costs and developing sophisticated survival strategies. The unmarried women you've learnt about tonight were pioneers, women who insisted on living according to their own values and choices even when that meant facing poverty, persecution, and social ostracism. Their determination to remain unmarried, despite all pressures to conform, helped gradually expand the range of options available to women, demonstrating that women could live meaningful lives outside marriage and challenging beliefs that marriage was women's only natural and legitimate destiny. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to think about the medieval woman who chose to enter a convent rather than marry the man her family selected for her, about the beguine supporting herself through textile work while living in community with other unmarried women, about the woman who falsely claimed to be a widow to access legal rights she couldn't otherwise have, about the teacher or scribe using her education to support herself independently. Think about the courage required to refuse marriage when everything in your society insisted marriage was mandatory, about the ingenuity required to survive without the economic support and legal protection marriage provided, about the determination to live according to your own values, even when that meant facing constant social pressure and judgment. Think about how these medieval women's struggles connect to modern women's lives. The next time you hear about women choosing careers over marriage, choosing to remain single rather than marrying partners who don't meet their standards, choosing independence over security, remember the historical context where women's choices were far more constrained and the costs of choosing independence were far higher. The ability to remain unmarried without facing destitution, legal vulnerability, and constant social condemnation. This is relatively recent achievement, only a few generations old, and it exists partly because medieval women who refused marriage demonstrated that women could survive and thrive outside marriage, despite systems designed to make that impossible. Remember that the medieval women who refused marriage were making reasoned choices about what kinds of lives they wanted to live, what risks they were willing to take, what values mattered most to them. A woman who entered a convent rather than marry was choosing religious life and community of women over marriage and family. A woman who falsely claimed to be a widow was choosing the risks of deception over the constraints of acknowledged unmarried status. A woman who lived with other unmarried women was choosing female community and mutual support over either marriage or isolation. These were strategic decisions, careful calculations of costs and benefits, not impulsive refusals to conform. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with deeper appreciation for the options and freedoms you have access to in your own life. Options to remain unmarried without facing poverty or persecution. Options to support yourself independently. Options to make choices about marriage based on your own desires and values, rather than on economic necessity or social compulsion. May you remember that these options weren't natural or inevitable, but were won through struggles that included medieval women's determined refusal to accept that marriage was mandatory, their creation of alternative survival strategies, their demonstration that women's capacities exceeded what society claimed. May you carry with you knowledge of the diverse paths unmarried women created, the abbess exercising religious authority, the beguine supporting herself through honest work, the teacher educating children, the scribe copying manuscripts, the woman managing inherited property as effective household head. Each of these paths demonstrated that women could live meaningful, productive, even influential lives without being wives and mothers. The existence of these paths challenged medieval beliefs that marriage was women's only legitimate destiny and gradually expanded understanding of what women's lives could encompass. Rest well tonight, knowing that every time you make choices about your own life, choices about whether to marry, whom to marry, when to marry, whether to prioritize career or education or other goals over marriage, you are exercising freedoms that medieval women largely didn't have, but that some of them fought for through their refusal to accept marriage as mandatory. The unmarried women who insisted on living according to their own values, who created survival strategies outside marriage, who demonstrated women's capabilities. They contributed to creating the expanded options available today. May you sleep peacefully with understanding that refusing social expectations and creating your own path has always required courage, determination, and often willingness to pay significant costs. Medieval women who refused marriage faced poverty, social ostracism, legal vulnerability, and constant pressure to conform. Yet they persisted, creating lives outside marriage and demonstrating that alternative paths were possible, even when society insisted they weren't. Their courage and determination remind us that social change begins with individuals who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must be. And may you wake tomorrow ready to honor the unmarried medieval women by remembering their stories, by appreciating the freedoms their struggles helped create, by recognizing that even in most constrained circumstances, people find ways to exercise agency and make choices that reflect their values. The woman who chose convent over marriage, the woman who supported herself through work, the woman who lived with other unmarried women in mutual support. They all made choices that expanded possibilities for women who came after them. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with images of medieval women creating lives outside marriage. The nun copying manuscripts in a convent scriptorium, the beguine at her loom producing fine textiles, the teacher instructing children in their letters, the false widow maintaining her carefully constructed identity, the women's household where unmarried women supported and protected each other. May you dream of the moment when a woman refused a marriage proposal her family demanded, choosing poverty and social disapproval over marriage to a man she found intolerable. May you dream of the communities of unmarried women, the networks of mutual support, the creation of alternative paths that demonstrated women could live without being wives. May your dreams remind you that marriage in medieval period wasn't love story, but survival strategy, economic necessity, social requirement. Women who refused marriage were refusing not just individual men, but entire social system that defined women primarily as wives and mothers. Their refusal challenged fundamental beliefs about women's nature and women's proper roles. And while individual unmarried women often paid heavy prices for their refusal, collectively they helped gradually transform understanding of what women's lives could encompass. Sweet dreams, and may you remember always that the freedoms you enjoy today, freedom to remain unmarried, freedom to support yourself independently, freedom to make choices about your life based on your own values and desires. These freedoms were built on struggles that included medieval women's determined refusal to accept that marriage was mandatory and their courageous creation of alternative paths, despite everything telling them those alternatives were impossible. Good night.